The emerald bracelet was not simply expensive. Its history reached into one of the most painful periods of Diana's royal life, carrying memories of loyalty, betrayal, inheritance, and a private promise that allegedly made its disappearance after her death almost impossible to explain. Anne did not begin with accusations. She began with memory. She thought back to the years when Diana was still moving through royal life under enormous pressure, smiling in public while privately struggling with a marriage that had become increasingly fractured. The bracelet had appeared during that period, and that detail mattered. It was not remembered as another glittering piece chosen to display royal status. To Diana, it had reportedly carried a more personal meaning. It represented something that belonged to her, not to the crown, not to tradition, and not to the machinery surrounding her title. That distinction made everything dangerous. Royal jewelry could fall into very different categories. Some pieces belonged to the crown, others were family heirlooms, loans, official gifts, or private possessions. On paper, those differences could look technical. Behind palace doors, they could decide who had the right to keep a jewel, who could inherit it, and who had no authority to touch it at all. Anne understood that immediately. She began quietly rebuilding the bracelet's history, moving through old inventories, remembered conversations, and carefully chosen questions directed toward former household staff. She could not afford to sound suspicious. The moment anyone realized what she was tracing, doors might close. One former aide remembered Diana speaking anxiously about her personal belongings during the most difficult years of her royal life. Diana had allegedly feared that once she was gone from the center of the institution, certain pieces that mattered to her might simply disappear into the wider royal collection, their personal meaning erased by paperwork. That memory disturbed Anne, because when she searched later discussions concerning Diana's jewelry, the emerald bracelet seemed to vanish. There was no dramatic announcement that it had been lost, no clear explanation that it had been transferred. It simply stopped appearing in the story. Then, Anne found something worse. An internal inventory reference that appeared to describe the bracelet had been shortened. The identifying details were vague. The emeralds remained mentioned, but the wording that might have made the piece immediately recognizable had disappeared. To anyone unfamiliar with Diana's possessions, it looked like ordinary administrative language. To Anne, it looked like concealment. Someone could have taken a jewel with a recognizable history and turned it into a line of paperwork almost impossible for an outsider to follow. That realization placed Anne in a conflict she had spent her entire life avoiding. She had always believed protecting the monarchy meant protecting its stability. But what if stability had been preserved by burying something that should never have been hidden? And there was another consequence she could no longer ignore. If Diana had considered the bracelet personally hers, then its eventual destination might not have been another royal collection at all. It could have been intended to remain connected to William and Harry. The deeper Anne followed the bracelet's paper trail, the less it resembled an accidental loss, and one missing entry pointed directly toward a private royal transfer made during the years when Diana's belongings were being quietly divided. Anne's search uncovered a transfer record that appeared ordinary until she compared the dates. A collection of jewels had been moved between royal residences, but one handwritten notation suggested Diana's emerald bracelet had entered a private cache years before Camilla was ever supposed to have access to it. At first, the record looked almost useless. It was buried among routine movements of valuables, the kind of administrative trail designed to attract no attention at all. But Anne had already learned that the smallest details mattered. She compared the measurements, the emerald setting, the clasp description, and the timing. Piece by piece, the vague entry began to resemble the bracelet too closely to dismiss. Diana's name was nowhere on the page. That absence only made Anne more suspicious. The transfer had taken place during a period when questions surrounding Diana's possessions were especially sensitive. The family was under pressure to avoid disputes, headlines, and any suggestion that her belongings had become a battlefield. In that atmosphere, silence could easily be disguised as discretion. Then, Anne noticed the initials. They belonged to a former senior courtier who had moved between Charles's household and the wider palace structure. Someone trusted enough to handle matters that were rarely explained in full. That discovery changed the nature of the mystery. The bracelet may not have been misplaced by accident. It may have traveled through official channels before disappearing into private hands. Anne needed more than paperwork. She contacted a retired member of staff who had worked around royal valuables during that period. The conversation was cautious from the beginning. At first, the former employee insisted that records from those years were complicated and that many movements happened under unusual circumstances. But Anne kept pressing. Eventually, the retired staff member admitted that certain pieces had been moved without the normal written authorization. Instructions had sometimes been delivered verbally, especially when senior members of the family wanted something handled quietly. Who gave those instructions? The answer did not come. Instead, Anne heard the phrase that instantly hardened her suspicion. It had been treated as a family matter. She knew those words too well. Inside royal life, they could mean almost anything. Privacy, protection, damage control, or simply a convenient way to stop people asking questions they were never expected to ask. Anne's frustration deepened because the issue was no longer about a hidden jewel. It was about authority. If the bracelet had truly been Diana's personal possession, and if her belongings were meant to remain connected to William and Harry, then who had decided that this piece could be redirected? Who had the power to move it without their knowledge? And why had nobody ever corrected the record? For the first time, Anne began to suspect that confronting Camilla alone would solve nothing. Camilla might only be the final keeper of a decision made much earlier. That possibility was more disturbing because it pointed toward people Anne had spent a lifetime protecting. And among them stood one person whose household had been linked to the transfer from the beginning. Anne had entered the mystery believing she might have to confront Camilla, but the transfer records forced her toward a far more painful possibility. The next person capable of explaining the bracelet was King Charles himself. Anne did not begin with an accusation. She placed one question before Charles and watched his expression change. Had Diana's emerald bracelet ever been transferred into another royal household? The king's answer was careful, but what he refused to say frightened Anne more than any confession could have. Anne had chosen privacy for a reason. No aides, no courtiers, no household staff close enough to hear a raised voice or a dangerous name. She needed to know what Charles remembered before anyone had time to prepare an answer for him. So she kept her opening question simple and deliberately incomplete. Had the bracelet ever been moved? Charles did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. Instead, he spoke about the confusion of those years, about inventories that had changed hands, belongings that had been divided, and records that were not always as clear as people imagined. Diana, he reminded Anne, had owned many pieces. Anne listened, but the vagueness only sharpened her suspicion. Then she mentioned the date. The atmosphere changed. She followed with the initials of the former courtier whose name appeared beside the transfer. Charles became more guarded. His answers slowed. He warned Anne that reopening disputes over old possessions could hurt people who were no longer alive to explain their decisions. Some matters, he suggested, had been settled during an extraordinarily painful time, but Anne heard something else in those words. He was talking about reputation, not ownership. That was exactly what she had feared. She asked him directly whether William and Harry had ever been told that the bracelet had disappeared from the records. Charles did not answer immediately. The silence between them carried more weight than anything he had said. Anne pressed again. Had Diana's sons known? Still no clear answer. For perhaps the first time in the entire search, this was no longer simply Princess Anne questioning a mystery. It was a sister challenging her brother over a piece of history both of them understood could still wound the family. Then Anne stopped testing him. She revealed the truth. She had seen the bracelet herself. It was not missing. It was not lost in storage. It existed, and she knew precisely where it had been kept. Charles's response came quickly, but he did not ask whether Anne was certain it was Diana's bracelet. He did not ask how she had identified it. He asked whether Camilla knew Anne had opened the drawer. Anne felt the meaning of that question immediately. If Charles had truly known nothing, disbelief should have come first. Instead, his concern was Camilla's awareness. That suggested he understood the connection before Anne had even explained it. For Anne, the mystery had just become something far more dangerous than misplaced jewelry. The institution she had spent her life defending now appeared to be standing between her and the truth. Charles had not admitted anything, but his first concern had not been whether Anne was mistaken, it had been whether Camilla knew. And that was enough to send Anne back toward the private drawer with an entirely different purpose. When Anne finally confronted Camilla, she expected denial. Instead, Camilla offered an explanation almost immediately. The bracelet had been given to her for safekeeping. But when Anne demanded to know by whom, the answer opened a second mystery more explosive than the first. Anne made certain the conversation remained private. After what Charles had revealed through his silence, she understood that one careless exchange in front of staff could turn a family secret into a palace crisis. So she went directly to Camilla and asked about the bracelet without ceremony. Camilla did not pretend ignorance. That alone changed everything. She acknowledged that the emerald piece had been in her possession for years and insisted that she had never considered it hers. According to her explanation, the bracelet had been placed with her because its ownership was unclear and because nobody wanted another dispute surrounding Diana's belongings. Anne was not satisfied. If the bracelet was being protected, why had it been kept in a private drawer? Why was there no clear record identifying where it was held? Why had its description become so vague that even the palace's own paperwork barely revealed what it was? Camilla's answer was chillingly simple. The secrecy, she claimed, had been the protection. Anything connected to Diana could reopen old emotions, old accusations, and old divisions. Bringing the bracelet back into official discussion, Camilla argued, might have created questions nobody wanted to answer. Keeping it out of sight had supposedly prevented conflict. To Anne, that logic was backwards. Hiding the object had not resolved the question. It had buried it. Then Anne asked the one thing Camilla seemed least willing to answer. Who gave her permission to keep it? Camilla hesitated before saying the instruction had come through Charles's household, but she would not name a specific person. No direct order, no signature, no single voice willing to take responsibility. Anne immediately recognized the problem. Charles had spoken as though the history was uncertain. Camilla now implied that his household had been involved. Each explanation seemed carefully shaped to avoid accusing the other. Yet together they created the impression of a decision everyone understood and nobody wanted attached to their name. Camilla insisted she had never worn the bracelet. She had never displayed it, claimed it, or treated it as part of her own collection. In her mind, that proved she had acted as a custodian rather than an owner. Anne rejected the distinction. A jewel could remain untouched for 20 years and still be wrongfully hidden. Safekeeping required accountability. Without that, secrecy became possession. Then Camilla said something Anne had not expected. If William learned the full story, she warned, the consequences might reach far beyond the bracelet itself. Old wounds could reopen, and questions about Diana's wishes might become impossible to contain. Anne focused on those words. Camilla had not merely suggested William would be hurt. She seemed to know that the bracelet's history involved him. Camilla's final warning stayed with Anne long after the confrontation ended. Because she had not said the bracelet would upset William, she had suggested its history could prove something he had never been told. A forgotten note attached to Diana's personal property records changed the entire meaning of the bracelet. Anne discovered that the emerald piece may not merely have belonged to Diana, it had allegedly been marked for eventual transfer to one of her sons, turning secrecy into a possible inheritance betrayal. Until that moment, Anne had been dealing with possession. Now she was dealing with intention. She went deeper into old household records, looking beyond formal inventories and into the quieter notes that often carried the real meaning behind family decisions. These were not grand legal declarations. They were private instructions, reminders, and references written at a time when Diana's belongings were being handled with extreme sensitivity. Then Anne found the line that changed everything. Certain sentimental pieces, it suggested, were to remain available for William and Harry and eventually for the families they would build themselves. The wording was careful, but the description of one emerald bracelet was difficult to ignore. The size, design, and identifying details appeared to match the piece Anne had found in Camilla's drawer. Suddenly, the question was no longer why Camilla had kept it. The question became what William and Harry had been denied. Anne felt the weight of that immediately. She knew how complicated William's position had always been. He had spent much of his adult life trying to honor Diana's memory without turning that loyalty into a public rejection of his father. Every reminder of the past carried a cost. That was why Anne hesitated. If she told William too soon, before proving every step in the bracelet's journey, she could ignite a family confrontation built partly on suspicion. But if she stayed silent, she would be repeating the same pattern that had allowed the mystery to survive for years. Then another document pushed her closer to a decision. A brief reference suggested that the bracelet had once been discussed as a possible future piece for William's wife. That meant Catherine's place in the story may have been quietly written long before anyone imagined the jewel would disappear from view. Anne now understood why the bracelet was so dangerous. If one piece connected to Diana's wishes had been redirected without explanation, what else might have been moved, renamed, or absorbed into private collections? One bracelet could open questions about an entire inheritance. Charles recognized that danger too. He privately urged Anne not to involve William yet. Let the matter be handled inside the family first, he argued. Give everyone time to understand what had happened. Anne refused. Keeping William uninformed, she told him, was not a solution. It was the reason the secret had become explosive in the first place. Camilla, meanwhile, appeared increasingly uneasy. The bracelet was becoming more than jewelry. It was becoming a symbol of Diana's memory, her son's inheritance, and the palace's habit of hiding painful decisions behind silence. And Anne had begun considering a step that would end that silence completely. For decades, the bracelet had survived through silence, paperwork, and locked drawers, but Anne had reached the one conclusion the palace feared most. If it had been meant for Diana's sons, then keeping it hidden was no longer protection. Anne returned to Camilla with a decision, not a request. The bracelet would be removed from her private possession and placed under independent royal inventory until its ownership was settled. What followed was not a shouting match, but a cold confrontation that divided the family instantly. For Anne, there was no longer any room for delay. Too many explanations had depended on silence, uncertainty, and private understandings that could not be tested. The bracelet had already spent years hidden behind vague records. Leaving it where it was would only continue the same pattern. Camilla objected immediately. She argued that removing the bracelet would transform a private family matter into an official royal problem. The moment it was documented under independent inventory, there would be a permanent record of where it had been found, who had held it, and why questions had been raised. That trail could not simply be erased later. Anne's answer was simple. That was exactly the point. She no longer wanted the bracelet protected by secrecy. She wanted it protected by evidence. Charles soon became involved, urging Anne to slow down. He asked for time so senior advisors could review the legal position, the family history, and the possible consequences. To him, caution was not weakness. It was the only way to stop the dispute from damaging the institution. But Anne had heard versions of that argument before. Another committee. Another private review. Another opportunity for responsibility to dissolve into careful language. She refused. The conflict now reached beyond Camilla and the bracelet. Charles believed the crown survived by containing crises before they became public. Anne believed that stability built on concealed family property was fragile from the beginning. Camilla took Anne's insistence personally. Even though Anne never called her a thief, the removal itself felt like an accusation. If the bracelet had to be taken from her under witnesses, what did that say about the trust placed in her? Behind closed doors, senior courtiers began quietly forming opinions of their own. Some feared Anne was opening a door that could never be closed. If Diana's bracelet was examined this carefully, other pieces connected to her might face the same scrutiny. Anne did not retreat. She made certain the bracelet was formally photographed, catalogued, sealed, and transferred with several people present. No vague verbal instruction this time. No hidden drawer. No disappearing description. And once that record existed, William could no longer be kept outside the story. He was finally informed that an item believed to have belonged to Diana had resurfaced after years of uncertainty. His reaction was controlled. No dramatic outburst, no immediate accusation. Only one question. Why was I never told? It was quiet, but devastating. Because that question was not really about the bracelet. It was about every decision made without him, every explanation withheld, and every person who had decided silence was safer than truth. The bracelet was finally out of the drawer, but removing it did not end the mystery. It stripped away the palace's ability to hide behind uncertainty, leaving William with one question nobody could answer without exposing the past. By the time William stood before the sealed bracelet, the argument was no longer about emeralds. It was about Diana, memory, inheritance, and whether protecting the crown had quietly become more important than telling her sons what happened to the pieces she left behind. William studied the bracelet carefully. The shape, the clasp, the deep emerald setting, details he had seen in old photographs and remembered from childhood, made the connection impossible to ignore. Whatever uncertainty had surrounded the paperwork, the emotional truth felt much harder to dismiss. Anne did not soften the story. She told him where the bracelet had been found, how the inventory trail had changed, which records had been vague, and how difficult it had been to trace the transfer through years of private decisions. She did not protect Camilla by hiding the drawer. She did not protect Charles by removing his household from the chain. For Anne, that stage was over. Charles finally acknowledged that Diana's possessions had been handled during an intensely difficult period. Decisions had been made under pressure, he argued, and not every choice from those years could be judged fairly with the distance of time. But he stopped short of admitting deliberate wrongdoing. Camilla remained equally firm. She insisted she had never believed the bracelet belonged to her. She had kept it because she had been instructed to protect it, and she had never worn it, displayed it, or claimed it as her own. William did not immediately attack her. That made his response more powerful. His concern was larger than one person. How, he wanted to know, could something connected so closely to his mother disappear into a private arrangement without either of her sons being told? How could a sentimental inheritance become so buried in royal procedure that its existence almost vanished with the people who remembered it? Anne understood exactly what he meant. Royal families, she admitted, could become dangerously skilled at calling silence protection. Difficult truths were delayed to preserve peace. Painful questions were left unanswered to protect reputations. But sometimes, silence did not remove the wound. It became the wound. The bracelet was formally separated from Camilla's private collection while its final ownership was reviewed. One possibility was that it would return directly to Diana's descendants. Another was that it would enter a clearly documented family collection permanently tied to her legacy, where its history could no longer be blurred. But the consequences had already moved beyond one jewel. Other possessions now faced fresh questions. Letters, gifts, personal pieces, items whose ownership had remained unclear after Diana's death suddenly looked different. Charles understood what Anne had done. She had created a precedent. Private understandings could now be challenged when family memory, inheritance, and accountability collided. And Anne knew the most frightening part was not that she had found the bracelet. It was how close the truth had come to disappearing with everyone who remembered it. Years after Diana's death, one small emerald bracelet had forced the monarchy to confront choices it believed history had already buried, and in doing so, proved that some legacies refused to remain locked away.